On behalf of the Smithsonian Center for Education and Museum Studies, I'd like to welcome you to the program this afternoon. My name is Stephanie Norby, and I'm the director of that office. But I'd also like to acknowledge two people that most of you probably know, and that's Bruce Craig and Nancy Fuller, who probably greeted you as you came in and were responsible for really putting the program together today. The Smithsonian Center for Education and Museum Studies, in collaboration with the Science Education Department at Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, established the G. Brown Goode Smithsonian Education Lecture in 2006. Through this series, named after the Smithsonian's earliest proponent of museums and educational institutions, Smithsonian staff can keep abreast of emerging developments in education pertaining to many aspects of their work, from exhibit design to outreach to schools. All of these lectures are webcast, so I'd also like to welcome our virtual audience, and if people are unable to watch it today, they can also see it at museumstudies.si.edu because we'll archive the lecture there. This year, the focus of these lectures is the role museums play in informal and formal education. We'd like you to mark your calendars for the second program in this series, the role of museums in formal education, and that will be held on Tuesday, May 6th. Bob Bain, the Associate Professor of History and Social Studies Education at the University of Michigan, is going to talk about his multi-year study to study teaching and learning history in museums and using museums and museum resources. Today our topic is learning across time and place, the role of museums in informal education landscape. Informal learning is an important but neglected topic. Less than 15% of school children's waking hours is spent in the classroom, and yet we know very little about how children use this time, the other 85%, and what impact it has on their learning and their success later in life. This program will look at the role learning plays in those other settings and times, at home, in museums, in after-school programs, and on the net, and in developing students' interest, readiness, and capacity to succeed both in school and as lifelong learners. I'm pleased to introduce our two speakers today. First, Professor Phillip Bell is the Associate Professor of Learning Sciences in the University of Washington, Seattle, and co-chair of the National Research Council's Informal Science Learning Committee. Dr. Bell will share his recent research from NSF-funded from the learning in informal and formal environments that examines how learning develops across time and settings. Our second speaker is Bronwyn Bevan, who is the director of the Center for Informal Learning and Schools, which is a partnership between the Exploratorium in San Francisco, King's College London, and the University of California, Santa Cruz. Her work focuses on partnerships between cultural institutions, science agencies, and schools. She has conducted numerous research and evaluation studies on the role of cultural institutions in supporting instructional change. Ms. Bevan will report on the NSF-funded research about learning and the role that museums can play in enhancing and extending learning that happens both in and out of school. They're going to present jointly, and after that joint presentation, they'll take questions from the audience. So please join me in welcoming our two speakers.
Hello, everyone. I'm Phillip Bell, and here we go. Bronwyn and I were just talking on the side here, and we actually wanted to just tweak our title, it's last minute. Because the frame for us is really learning across kind of time and place and pursuits in such a way that actually makes the formal and informal kind of dichotomy a problematic one in a lot of ways, and we can talk more about that as we kind of get further into things. So I'm going to start off. We have a kind of a back and forth dance of presentations this morning with your involvement as well. And so we'll start off by kind of framing the two centers and the work of the two centers. We'll then ask you to have some small group discussion for just a few minutes related to some of the themes that we'll lift up in the front part. We'll talk a little bit about theory, and then we'll go into each of the center's research projects for more in-depth talk with some questions in there for the room as well. So I'm from the learning sciences academic field. It's an interdisciplinary field pulling from across the social sciences and education to do work focused on learning and teaching. Learning as a construct in the social science view is one of the most complex ones that we have, and we do have a range of consensus volumes that have been brought together, kind of synthetic theoretical accounts of what we do and don't know about learning and teaching. These are just a set of those. Within the Life Center, our charge as one of the 6 Science of Learning centers that the National Science Foundation is currently funding has been to kind of pop up out of our current view and try to think about. So if we imagine what the 2015 edition looks like of how people learn or how students learn, what is it that we want to correct in the kind of the research literature now so that it can accumulate in new ways? And we'll get into the details of some of the directions we're heading in to try to move in that direction. The Life Center, we're 3.5 years in as a center. We have about 80 people, about 40 research studies active at a given time. It's a collaboration between 2 units on the University of Washington campus. The College of Education is the lead unit. The Institute for Learning Brain Sciences is a collaborating unit on campus. We have colleagues at Stanford University from different departments there, largely education, but also communication and other neuroscience departments there on campus, and then SRI International, who work with us to do the education, collaboration, and outreach part of the work. The purpose of the Life Center is to develop and test principles about the social foundations of human learning in informal and formal environments, including how people learn to innovate in contemporary society with the goal of enhancing human learning from infancy to adulthood, which is a very broad, scary mission, actually, in a lot of ways. And it took us, really 3 years to try to get to the point where we could see kind of the shared focus across the broad range of work that I'll quickly describe to you. So when we started the center, the frame was that there are different corners of the academy and the practice fields that do work related to teaching and learning. They don't necessarily spend as much time talking to each other as you might hope and developing kind of synthetic accounts of learning across them. So our first strand of work that we brought into the center focused on implicit learning in that framing, and they do a lot of developmental psychology experimental work in the lab. They also do a lot of cognitive and social neuroscience imaging around language development, empathy development, those sorts of things. There's a broad category of work that you'll hear the most about from me today because I'm one of the leads of the informal learning strand. And there we do largely ethnographic work coming from a social and cultural theoretical perspective to understand the details of learning across time and place. And then we have a strand of research that comes mostly out of cognitive psychology, experimental work on alternatives between instructional approaches and how that's connected to particular outcomes of interest. And so across this space, trying to think about what we can say synthetically that's new in terms of across that broad set of disciplinary perspectives about teaching and learning. We have 3 high-order questions, and they may not all fit given what the font is doing here. First one is about social foundations, and if we think about the social nature of learning, how is it that the nature of that social learning is similar or different across domains, contexts, and developmental periods in a person's life? Social practices, what are, and I'll say a lot more about this one, in terms of what are the barriers and bridges to learning as people navigate across settings that are kind of given labels of formal and informal kind of education designations. And then the third has to do with a set of questions about, so if we understand this about kind of the social and practice-based natures of design, of learning, how do we take that into account in thoughtful ways in the actual educational designs that we're working on? So as we kind of brought these scholars into a room and tried to figure out how to talk to each other, one of the things that we ended up developing was this diagram that gives us kind of a high-level view of learning. And so across the horizontal, you can think of it as just the life course of an individual. So it's kind of the life long learning perspective. But across the vertical is the kind of bringing into focus the life-wide nature, and so we kind of then very roughly pull apart kind of the gold moments where you are in a formal learning environment, kind of compared to kind of the sea of blue, we call it, of informal learning venues in your life. And it's really just there's a lot of complexity that isn't represented in the diagram, and it's intended to really kind of start conversations about people who usually work in one part of the space or the other. The study I'll actually be describing today goes after a vertical swath right around kind of 4th and 5th grade with a group of children that we've been working with. The work of the center, when we started, we collaborated with Dr. Jim Banks, who heads up the Center for Multicultural Education. One of the corrective things that is apparent to us is to try to, when we think about the existing consensus reports on human learning, is to try to bring kind of issues of cultural learning kind of more to the fore. There's a larger pocket of work now to think about in that way. And so we're kind of, we had gone through a full consensus process with a group of scholars who do cultural research on learning, usually within diverse communities, to try to bring together principles of learning that may not be apparent in the how people learn kind of frame. So to quickly, the committee, as we were deliberating, we advanced kind of 3 concepts and 4 principles. So just here in the opening part, I'm going to talk about the 3 concepts and then hand it off to Bronwyn to talk about CILS. First concept, I think, is pretty straightforward. It's the lifelong learning notion that there are particular things learned, acquired over the life course that give you greater facility to engage with information, to make judgments, to engage in arguments, and there's a developmental part to that. The life-wide nature is a little bit more unique in the sense, I don't think we talk about it quite as much, but learners navigate across a diverse set of kind of social ecologies, places on a very routine course, in and out of school or in and out of college programs or in and out of work, in ways that actually kind of give very specific kind of constraints and opportunities for learning across the width of somebody's life. So learning then derives in this view in kind of opportunistic and patterned ways from this breadth of daily experience that takes place, where particular resources or norms or practices are present within particular places where you spend time, whether it's the dinner conversation table or whether it's the workplace. So one unique aspect of that is, though, learners are the ones typically left with the brunt of actually navigating across those spaces, which are often driven kind of by different norms and value systems that guide kind of what counts as teaching and learning. Which brings us to the third theme, which is kind of in the kind of the into the screen part of the lifelong and life-wide diagram, and it has to do with life-deep learning, and it orients us to the particular kind of religious, moral, ethical, and social values that guide what people believe, how they act, and how they judge themselves and others in those different parts of one's experience. So it's the value systems kind of bound up in learning. And so in this view, learning and development and education and intelligence and these things that we talk about as constructs to help us understand teaching and learning are bound up in value systems in ways that are quite complicated. Jerome Bruner kind of has this one quote which helps kind of bring this into focus, I think, that how people believe the mind works will, we now know, have a profound effect on how it is compelled to work if anybody is to get on in a culture. And that fact, ironically, may turn out to be a robust cultural universal. So in this sense, that there are very particular systems that we build in different parts of education that compel particular kinds of development and learning to kind of steer people's trajectories. So with that, I'm going to turn it over and introduce Bronwyn Bevan from the Exploratorium.
Hi. Thanks, Phil, and thank you to the Smithsonian for having us here, and especially to Nancy and Bruce for being so gracious and welcoming us and getting us here. As Phil said, I'm just going to give you kind of an overview of the Center for Informal Learning and Schools. I'm at the Exploratorium, which is a science museum in San Francisco, and we're in partnership with King's College London and the University of California, Santa Cruz. It's funded by the National Science Foundation in 2002, so we're about 6 years into it. And one of the differences between this center and the Life Center is that CILS is what NSF called a Center for Learning and Teaching. They funded 15 of them, and they were really designed as leadership centers. So they were focused on a particular problem, you know, small p in quotes, problem area related to, I'm going to just sort of shorthand it and say science education because I'm from a science museum, but really science, technology, engineering, and math. So all of these different centers tackled a different problem. One is looking at assessment of science learning. One is looking at mathematics education for bilingual Spanish-English speakers. Another one's looking at curriculum and mathematics in urban settings, et cetera. And the programs are mostly graduate student programs, so doctoral programs, postdoc research projects, in order to build the next generation of people who are going to have deep understanding around these particular issues and can contribute over the next decades towards you know, tackling these issues, whatever they are. And I just want to say one quick thing about the notion of center. It actually is really important that these were centers and not projects, because centers, first of all, there's more money associated with them, but there's also a sense of time, so 5 to 10 years. And these partnerships, so they're multi-institutional, and that allows the centers to tackle really complex problems and sort of gain traction on multiple levels. And also, as a center as such kind of creates a gravitational field around it. So people come to centers, call or email centers, looking for information, and that has led to, we've found, a whole sort of suite of partnerships and projects that weren't necessarily envisioned in the beginning. And most importantly, these two features lead to a third, which is that centers have the ability to actually reframe problems, to kind of refine the problem that you started off with, and to think really very deeply about the methods and the techniques that are needed to better understand and apply your understanding. So a little bit of what we'll be talking about today is actually the reframing of the problem, and that was very apropos that Phil changed the name of the presentation in that regard. So this is an overhead shot at the Exploratorium, which was just very briefly founded in 1969 as one of the first interactive hands-on science museums. I won't talk much about the museum, but I just want to say that our center, CILS, was funded to really think about what was called informal learning. So there was this infrastructure out there. There were these buildings, as we're in one now, and a whole set of them here, obviously, these places where people could see very active, engaged learning. And the question was sort of what to make of that. So the NSF and the panels, while 14 of the other centers really focused on formal education, wanted to better understand sort of what the sets of possibilities are, what the contributions are around informal learning. So our mission specifically is to broaden conceptions of learning. So to really say learning is much broader than what people think about when they think about desks and rows, or even seats in rows in an auditorium. And also to understand the contributions that, in our case, informal science institutions, we use that phrase ISIs, meaning zoos, aquaria, nature centers, all sorts of museums, science centers that contribute to the science education. I want to say that what's important to know going into this is that really this is a very new field of study. In other words, of course, there's been a lot of work done on museums, museum educations, museum and society, and there have been studies done of learning in museums as well over the decades. But really thinking about how that kind of learning, how these kinds of institutions fit within a broader framework, what are the relationships, what are the opportunities and possibilities, connecting learning across settings, is actually in many ways a new domain of study. So CILS was in 2002, the Life Center came a couple of years later with a very heavy emphasis on research. Another effort was the Coalition for Science After School. The panel that Phil co-chairs was founded in 2006. NSF just a couple of years ago started this program called AYS, Academies for Young Scientists. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. but that is designed specifically to fund out-of-school time programs that forge strong connections with school programs in science education. So what I want to say about this in terms of it being an emergent field is we didn't really, we formed the center, we had a topic, but we didn't ourselves really fully understand what the problem was, what the questions were, how to approach this. Are we talking about field trips when we think about informal learning in schools? Are we talking about classes in schools? We knew we were talking about something much bigger and much broader. And we really spent a number of years working collaboratively with lots of people, figuring out exactly what that problem is. And over this time, as you saw from that list, a lot of other people have become interested in this question, and a lot of work is going on all over the world, really, including we work with people in Europe and other places. Okay, so this is just very quickly a kind of a description of what we offered in CILS. So PhD programs, postdoctoral research. We have a professional development program for informal science educators. Worked with about 80 people over a period of 3 or 4 years. We've done research, and we hold an annual conference. So this was really about, as I said, building kind of a cadre of people who are thinking about, in multiple ways, from multiple positions, about this complex issue. Our faculty, by the way, are really stellar scholars in different fields. In developmental psychology, Barbara Rogoff and Maureen Callanan at the UC Santa Cruz, Jonathan Osborne, Justin Dillon, Christian Heath at King's College, Radha Gawa, Doris Ash, and Judith Moskovich at Education at Santa Cruz as well. The programs were different at the different places, but there were some common threads that I would say that came through for certainly all of the people in the graduate programs, and that was that, first of all, that learning is profoundly cultural and social. Secondly, a focus on how informal settings support the development of science literacy and complicating and unpacking what science literacy means. And finally, kind of looking at new methods for understanding this. So overall, a little bit of delay here, yeah. I would say that the people who participated in CILS, including the practitioners, gained through this process of really thinking through this problem an expanded view of what constitutes learning and how learning is constituted, the multiple sites in which learning takes place, and also the overlapping purposes of different educational institutions that are involved in the educational enterprise. So starting to see the common ground between schools, between after-school programs, between youth development programs, between museums, et cetera. So I'm just going to close with a couple of thoughts before giving it back to you. We're going to pose some questions to you. We conducted many different studies, and we'll be talking about that a little bit a little bit later. But I want to talk a little bit just about the reframing that happened. So this happens to be a picture of the Exploratorium. And so, but the idea is museum. It looks somewhat like a museum, although it wasn't created as such. But basically, through this process of the last six years, we think that we've, and as I think other people are doing as well, we really tried to reframe the problem of what formal and informal learning is and what the connection is. And one of the first things that we got to, after about 2 years, was that there really is no such thing as informal learning. That it's a misnomer to think that learning is fundamentally different as such, and there is informal and formal learning. We do talk a lot about setting and how setting constrains and enables different types of learning. We can talk more about that later. Also, importantly, that as museums, it's really important to kind of decenter and not to think about the museum as the center of the universe, which sometimes we do, and how do we get to the learner, how does the learner get to us, but rather to conceptualize the whole problem from starting with the learner at the center and understanding how what the museum may mean to the learner in relation to a whole number of other experiences and opportunities and settings that the learner is engaged with, and the work at Life really deals directly with this issue. And finally, that boundaries and labels and categories that circumscribe museums with regard to learning specifically. There are clearly institutional and other kinds of issues that are specific to museums. But with regard to learning, that they're ultimately self-defeating, and we have some research that shows in what ways new possibilities, including the financial health of institutions, are really affected when museums start to think about themselves as part of a broader landscape and not as fundamentally different on their own. So I'm just going to share with you this graphic. This is a draft. This is the second time we're sharing it in public that we're working on to help to conceptualize things. So this is probably 4 or 5 iterations away from being really useful. But you have to imagine this. I'm going to try and talk through it quickly. You have to imagine this as all moving parts. So those are the arrows. So we sort of think of it as a pie on a spinning pie plate, and this band in the middle also spins. So working with the idea of legitimate peripheral participation, which some of you may know from Leib and Wenger, this idea that as you enter into a community of practice, you start off as a novice, and over time, as you engage and start to master the practices, you become more and more expert. But also keeping in mind that we're not trying to reify expertise in any particular way, but we're just saying that there's this general move toward more sophisticated practices. Working with from our theoretical basis that we're working with, we've identified these kind of 8 different components that we're suggesting make up science literacy. So use of tools and technology, and understanding sort of the meaning and the relevance, having ideas and questions. But the point of the spinning plate beneath is that these kinds of capacities in these different areas are developed in lots of different places, and that it's probably not correct to expect any one place to be the sole source of development for any one of these things. And it's probably not even correct to say this kind of space is always going to be able to handle these 6 things, and if they don't handle these 6 things, there's a problem. But rather to understand the constant sort of dynamic and relational interactions that the learner has with different opportunities over time and space. And the other thing I want to say is that, like the life-wide, lifelong graph that doesn't yet show the life deep, there's something 3-dimensional here too about time, which this doesn't actually show, because we don't want to suggest that people move in a linear fashion toward the middle, but actually that this could look different for different people depending on where they are in their development, including age, but not limited to age. So this is just a way of saying that as we talk later, we're trying to think about how to relate development of capacities with opportunities to learn and the different settings that are out there, and where museums may or may fit within that general development. So that's sort of background on the 2 centers. And actually, we wanted to throw it back to you for a couple of minutes to ask you if you could talk with your neighbors just for a couple of minutes about these questions. And then we're going to ask for a few of you, if you would, to share what your discussions were. And it's in part just to let us know what you're thinking about and what you're working with, because we don't necessarily know. But anyway, and it's in part to lead into the next part of this section, so the discussion. So the questions we're asking you to talk to each other about for a couple of minutes are, who are the learners who come to your museums and programs? What do you know about them, their interests in your subject matter, and how are they, what do they spend their time doing when they're in that sea of blue, that other 85% from the life graph, when they're not in your museum? What's driving them out there, and how does that connect with their visit? So we'll give you a couple of minutes. If you wouldn't mind talking to each other, introduce yourself if you don't know each other, and then we'll ask you to share.
So about 1 more minute, and if anyone is willing to share, there are microphones on both sides. Thanks. Okay, why don't we come back together? That was fabulous. Like when you throw it to the room, you never quite know what's going to happen, right? So that's exciting. And so would anyone like to share any of the details out of their small group discussion for the whole room, just to help orient us to kind of the learners in question in your part of the world, and kind of what they might be doing across their life? Thoughts? Please. Yeah. Professional. Mm-hmm. That's great. That's a great example of teacher, for those who didn't hear, teachers coming to a program kind of for professional needs, but bringing more of their whole kind of selves as learners to that moment and their motivations and interests. How about another kind of learner audience in a different direction? Please, in the middle. Right. That's right. That's fabulous. So kind of unlike other institutions, kind of the sheer breadth of the Smithsonian is one dimension, and then how people are kind of vectoring into different parts of that to be kind of more direct interest to them as they show up to navigate a visit or that. Please, one more. Right. That's fabulous. In a different project, I work with beach volunteers who stand on beaches and help kind of the public or school groups of children come and interpret the beach and engage with it. And they actually are kind of struggling with the same thing. The interaction is kind of assumed to be not about learning from each other, kind of in a deeper way where people bring things to the conversation, but more kind of quick interactional kind of, Q&A sorts of interaction. So we're going to move on, and that's great. Thank you. And we'll kind of carry kind of this space with us as we kind of think forward into the talk. We wanted to get some theoretical perspectives and learning principles on the table to begin with. Of course, like in terms of, I talked about how broad a notion in the social sciences learning is. And there are just all sorts of literatures out there that come from a broad set of perspectives that make certain things visible, as theoretical perspectives do, and kind of occlude others. And so this is just, it's not meant to be exhaustive, tried to be somewhat broad in kind of a detailing of the range of perspectives that have kind of been operating on helping to understand different cultural, material, kind of very contextual aspects of learning, very broad, spanning, to try to understand how learning gets spread across people or between a person and a thing that they're working with, and how to account for learning means stretching across. So there's a very broad set. Now, if you look at the How People Learn book that I referenced earlier, it advances 3 high-level principles. One has to do with building on prior knowledge. It's the constructivist nature of knowing bit. It's like building on what people bring rather than assuming nothing. The second one is to engage the learner in an active construction of their own understanding through all sorts of ways, either experimentation or argumentation or sense-making or different ways of making it an active process. And then the third principle that it advances has to do with trying to understand the metacognitive parts of learning. So you're thinking about your own learning, thinking about your own thinking in a way that helps you navigate your learning process. The report I was referencing before, Learning in and Out of School in Diverse Environments, tried to bring 4 other principles into focus. So let me quickly just get them on the table. The first one, and this is again coming out of a cultural framing of learning. Learning is situated in broader socioeconomic and historical contexts and is mediated by local cultural practices and perspectives. And this was a broad principle thought to hold. Our institutions are historically rooted. They focus on certain areas and not others. Our other structures are also historically rooted and have kind of political dimensions to them that foreground equity and inequities in certain ways. And specific communities have kind of established local practices that kind of connect back in time, but then also evolve and are kind of dynamic as they unfold into the future. Learning takes place not only in school, but also in the multiple contexts and valued practices of everyday lives across the lifespan. I think we've already gotten that principle going in our discussion. All learners need multiple sources of support from a variety of institutions to promote their personal and intellectual development. So, a teacher repurposing professional development program in a certain way to connect to their interest is kind of an instance of kind of navigating multiple sources of support in that way. Fourth principle, learning is facilitated when learners are encouraged to use their home and community language resources as a basis for expanding their linguistic repertoires. And there's a huge body of work that kind of talks about the details of interaction, of talk, of kind of building conversations in ways that are culturally rooted, in ways that set up complications as people navigate across boundaries and across expectations that get imposed on them based on how they interact and how they engage in certain discourses. Bronwyn.
Okay, we're not going to do too much more of this. What I'm going to do is just very briefly talk about some of the theoretical strands that go through the work of CILS and lead to some emergent questions, which I'll get to at the end. Because we have, as I explained, different faculty working in different institutions, what I'm about to present doesn't actually represent any one person's synthetic view. It's really a number of strands that cut across and weave in and out of the work. One is cultural historical activity theory, chat, and Phil has already talked about this. I mean, it sees that learning is profoundly social and cultural, and that culture itself is dynamic and is shaped and also shaping of human activity, and also that learning happens in interaction, in relationships among and between learners, the tools that they use, whether they're the labels outside or the actual artifacts that people are looking at, and the environments and context and historical moment, in fact. Another theory that we're using, which really comes from the work of Rod Ogawa at UC Santa Cruz, but it's a very interesting addition to some of the work that's gone on around this question, is neo-institutionalism, or it's institutional theory is part of organizational theory. It's a constructivist theory that on the one hand sees institutions such as museums, schools, also larger constructs like government, press, as drivers of society, but also sees them, institutions, as historically and culturally constituted, so that they are created at certain times by certain historical and cultural conditions, and in a sense those conditions get structured into those institutions. And there's a theory, neo-institutionalism has a theory for reproduction of institutions. But for example, schools, which really, the modern school, quote unquote, was founded really at the end of the 19th century, and going into the early 20th century, it sort of adopted, as it was trying to process massive numbers of immigrant students, it adopted kind of a factory model. And the argument is that that model of thinking about teaching and learning and learners and knowledge is kind of instantiated now in schools in very deep and structural ways. So there's a question about museums, and especially as museums have sort of reinvented themselves over the years. And it's particularly salient to our field of science centers, which really was founded only 30 or 40 years ago. Also, this point that institutions afford, so as they're structured, they afford particular constraints and opportunities for activity. This isn't a theory so much as to say that we're also thinking about science teaching and learning, and definitely science is inquiry, thinking about scientific evidence and argumentation as a core part of what it means to know and do science, and thinking about science in relationship to everyday life and practice. And the point there is science as having meaning and personal relevance for learners. The fourth piece is just, it's in a way a subcategory of our cultural historical activity theory work, but we're looking, in one of the studies I'll talk about later, specifically about this idea of interest, because as you know, in museums, people come because they're interested, they get more interested when they're here, they talk later about how their interest is developed. We're trying to think that through a little bit more, and building on the work of especially Hedy and Renninger's four-phase model of interest development, and also the work of NSF-funded, we're defining interest as a reciprocal relationship. Hedy and Renninger talk about it as a reciprocal, dynamic relationship between positive dispositions and skills and knowledge that are adequate to allow for engagement. And they describe interest development as you become more sort of capable of engaging, your disposition becomes more positive. As your disposition is more positive, you engage further, your skills and your knowledge increase, etc. So that's their model, and we add to it Stetsenko's theories around the very important sense of historical, sort of past, present, and future, and the learners, the need for learners to understand how they personally kind of fit in with a body of work, and how they can participate and contribute to it. So it's adding a sense of future to interest. So from these different kind of pieces that we're looking at or taking into account, I just want to share with you some questions that are maybe salient to people in the museum community. One is how different institutional settings create different opportunities to engage and develop. In our case, STEM is science, technology, engineering, and math interest. Also, how does interest development draw on and also play out in other settings? This is very much the work that LIFE is looking at. And then finally, this question, and it's a big question, of how institutions can cooperatively, maybe intentionally, organize opportunities to reinforce and expand possibilities for learners. And on one end of the scale, you can get into very dangerous territory of saying, well, we're going to check off all the standards in this non-school setting because we're sort of working to reinforce other kinds of sets of expectations that are designed for other institutions. On the other end of this scale, so I'm not recommending that, by the way. On the other end of the scale is sort of a complete disregard to thinking about the other kinds of knowledge or opportunities that children or learners generally are encountering in their life, and how what we do can reinforce and expand and maybe challenge what they're learning in other places. So I think that it's a big question. We obviously don't ever want to be moving in lockstep with any sort of set of institutions, because we want to sort of work from our strengths, but we also have to think about how we negotiate to create more opportunities for people. So one of the questions is, how can teaching and learning in informal settings tap into the learner's imagination? how it can present material as historical and cultural endeavors to which learners can contribute both now, in the immediate moment as they're engaged with it, but also in their future. And finally, this idea of how to present and how to engage in teaching and learning in museums in ways that connect with everyday lives and interests. And by everyday, that means really, that's the sea of blue, and it's also the formal setting, perhaps. It's the ideas that people bring with them and are going to play out later. Oops, that's the end of that one. So now we're going to hand it back to Phil, and we're going to talk about some studies.
I think we're going to press on here in the interest of time and all that. Okay, so now we have two sets of kind of research pieces to tell you, and I will actually be talking about two studies that are coming out of my group after I do some initial framing of the broader project in the group. And it can be thought of as kind of this high-level goal of discovering and supporting successful pathways in children's learning in and out of school. And if you want to learn more, everydaycognition.org is a place where we try to put some information about what we're up to. So again, reminding us of this particular split between what could kind of labeled formal and informal. The How People Learn book largely went after the 19% of formal, if you look at the volume. That's not completely true, but it mostly spoke to issues of formal instruction as it was doing its work. The NRC committee that I'm involved now is kind of more centered around the other 81% and trying to think about that, and then the work of my research group is to kind of do work across the boundary to follow the learner across that set of spaces. So one way to conceptualize this work is kind of this grand scientific challenge of how do everyday moments experienced across places and pursuits add up in some way, not directly in a cumulative way, but in a complicated way, to understanding, expertise, identity, these things we care about. The methodological strategy that we've been able to pursue under the auspices of the LIFE Center is a relatively straightforward one to engage in ethnographic work where we actually follow the same children across as many social settings as possible to piece together these learning pathway stories. And so you get a sense of, I have to admit, like, so having an ethnographic talk that's being video cast means I basically can't show you any identifiable data, which from an ethnographer's point of view is really problematic because it is the video, data that is the rich presentation of social life. And so I'm talking around it mostly today. So just for that interest. That's why all the images are kind of slightly askew in terms of the learner not being visible, for example. So we're working on this particular conceptualization of learning pathways and how that relates to the development of expertise, focus on how they construct these learning pathways and how that happens through particular arrangements they put in place and longer pathways related to that, and how they fall into the learning arrangements of others, a student going into the classroom or a mother and daughter walking into the museum, and how they then repurpose that space to fit into their broader personal agenda of working out a learning pathway sort of moment. So in this frame of thinking about what exactly are these barriers and bridges that come into place across settings and pursuits, and what social supports can be put in place to try to help that happen. Specifically, we're going after kind of social, cultural, and material arrangements of how this plays out. The slides are bleeding off the bottom, but we're going to just push forward because it's exemplified through the data. It's basically trying to think about the process by which people piece together these learning pathways. In terms of the subject matter focus of the work, because social life is such a broad set of possible things, we bracket it in four thematic ways. The first is to look at what we call personally consequential biology. So this is understanding of the living world that's bound up in kind of aspects of everyday life that are consequential: health, nutrition, local environment, that set of things. So it's kind of the content and kind of theme that we're orienting to. It's also a set of practices. Second one has to do with whether or not individual learners are affiliating with science as something that they're interested in or see a possible future in. And so we're looking at the vast array of images of science that they encounter from media and teachers and curriculum and friends and parents and museums to see how they then sort themselves into those different images and how they make sense of what counts as science. The third one, going back to the active construction of knowledge point from earlier, argumentation is a very powerful mechanism by which to learn, and so youth spend a lot of time engaging in arguments across the settings of their life. So we've gone onto, out onto the kickball field at recess, and to dinner conversations with siblings, to synagogues and different places. We're trying to piece together how children know how to argue. And then the fourth theme has to do with technological fluencies that they develop. And in this sense, we actually tried not to do this theme because we had too much other stuff going on. But after the first week of field work, technology was bound up in the learning pathways of children so deeply, it snuck right back onto the table. So I'm going to talk about two studies and kind of quickly telegraph the kinds of things we're seeing with this learning pathway frame. First one has to do with the sense-making processes of what we refer to as kind of practiced families as they navigate a science center. In this particular study, it's taking place within the Pacific Science Center in Seattle, another kind of interactive science center very much kind of in parallel to the Exploratorium. The analytical focus here is really on the biology-related exhibits that families come across in these three categories as they navigate the museum. And then specifically trying to understand this sense-making process as they go about their visit. And they range from 2 hours to 4.5, or it's kind of variable, but it's across the course of the visit. And I'll say more about kind of what we mean by practice in just a moment. This builds off prior work that's gone after understanding kind of learning in kind of on the museum floor, family learning research, cognitive expertise formation work that's related, how families piece together knowledge, how children piece together knowledge together, how talk is accomplished in museums specifically, and then gender issues that are kind of bound up based on particular dynamics that we're looking at in the sense-making process. So the high-level question, how do families make sense of the exhibit through their talk and actions? During the sense-making process, what is the range of biological ideas expressed in their talk? And then what learning resources do families draw upon during that sense-making process? So there's a variety of things that might get invoked when you're walking through a museum to make sense of the exhibits and the lines of discussion that you're engaged in with your family. The participants, so 15 families, 44 individuals. The practice sense I referenced before, the families are all Science Center members. They report frequent visits. They come instrumentally to the Science Center for educational activities, and the children were recruited out of a summer program that was in place at the Science Center. In terms of actual arrangements, there's a variety of configurations of families that were kind of going through the study. Single pairings, having the whole family there, having different configurations. The method was to actually have a shadow set of ethnographers, after the family had been kind of wired with microphones to follow them through their visit. And so there's some imagery in the presentation where you can kind of see that at work, collecting the data. So it's kind of the video shadowing kind of method, and then we have pre and post interviews to try to get a sense of interests and activities the family engages in, their background, and whether or not they thought the visit was typical or not after they've managed it. So I don't expect you to read this map, but basically what we can do is then take a 2 to 3 hour visit and then actually develop a sense-making map of how families engage at a pretty high level as they go through. In this particular visit, particular resources come into play at particular moments as kind of unfold in this biology talk within this family. If we look across the families, we see that everyday life gets integrated into that exhibit sense-making in pretty interesting ways, that rather than just discussing the exhibit text and the signage and elsewhere, that families regularly shared facts and questions and stories and jokes that can be traced back, if you look at kind of an everyday sourcing kind of frame, to their schooling, work, popular media, prior museum exhibits, and other life experiences that are all being kind of brought together to make sense of what's happening on the floor. We have a kind of a set of descriptive categories that kind of go after the different features of this talk, so you can kind of get into pretty micro details of what kind of family engages what kind of talk and what kind of things hang together. Now, if we pop up a level and look at the bigger categories, you start to see kind of the knowledge talk that goes on within a family, where in the paper that kind of came off of the study, we talk about how the biological knowledge that's being referenced from a previously learned moment is being brought in to make very specific strategic connections to something that's cued off of the museum, the exhibit design in particular, and they're trying to make sense of it, and that it's kind of this complex web of interplaying between these different categories as we look at the learning pathway talk that gets constituted. If we then look back and just look at the kind of the important layer of data about questions and statements that get posed during a visit, these 4 families are representative of the broader set, in where you actually see that mothers take on a pretty instrumental role as a learning partner, kind of posing questions and offering statements in ways that is pretty bound up in it's representative across the families. Now, what's interesting about this is that there's actually prior work that's kind of lab-based research around how families do informal talk that shows that fathers tend to do more of that talk, at least in the lab-based work that's been done. So at least within this particular community, in this particular space, mothers are engaging in kind of more of that active kind of learning shaping kind of talk. So to pop up a little bit and to move on to the next study, so practiced museum-going families construct these complex pathways, these discourses, as they navigate through the museums. They draw upon a variety of diverse cultural resources from scientific and non-scientific sources as they make sense of the things they're encountering, and that mothers seem to play this unique role, at least within this context. Design implications off of this, thinking about explanations and expertise actually being distributed across the family as a way to understand sense-making. It's not individuals engaging in this, it's actually collections of people kind of invoking their shared history in some ways, and their unique histories, in order to make sense of kind of what's right in front of them. And that these cultural resources invoked by the families might actually hold design clues for shaping how to kind of construct the conversations around a particular exhibit space. And so trying to encourage these kind of navigations of shared experience would be kind of a direction that this would kind of fit within. So I'm going to now transition to a very different kind of study, and this is the learning pathway study, where we get to look across the life width perspectives on learning. So team ethnography, and we have kind of 3 high-level goals. The first is to understand the everyday expertise that children cultivate related to science and technology in their lives. We look at the cultural foundations by which that comes into place, and then we actually are in partnerships with classroom teachers to leverage what we learn about children's everyday expertise to design formal instruction, and the list of researchers off to the right are engaged in this work together. In terms of the methods, the way to think about it is that we have between 100 and 150 hours with 13 children across the settings of their life, and so we have these child ethnographies where we get pretty detailed senses of what's going on within their life around what they care about. Broad range of different kinds of data that are coming into play around that. In conjunction with that, we spend time routinely in their school. They were all recruited out of the same school initially, and so we have a school ethnography that corresponds to the lives of these children. A broad set of methods, a lot of it's participant observation with video in the home, out on family walks, in the car, off to the shopping mall, off to the science center. We also have self-documentation tasks where we'll hand cameras to children and have them self-document aspects of their life to bring more data to bear to help us see things that we can't otherwise see, and then we kind of develop these more kind of thick accounts out of the broad corpus. To give you a quick sense of the fieldwork, we have about 2,000 hours of fieldwork data in the lives of these 13 children and in the school at this point. We started out in the school, we then recruited the families, and then last spring we took those 2 channels of data and used that to kind of shape 7 weeks of classroom instruction focused on personally consequential microbiology, actually. And we're lining up to do that again in a second iteration this spring. This list will give you a quick sense of the kinds of settings where we've spent time. So beyond the homes, but also, shopping malls and different cultural events. And this has been a fascinating experience. And so we get to see how a moment in a dog training school, kind of puppy garden, it's like kindergarten for puppies, right, connects to a neighborhood walk 4 months later where a particular memory from that puppy garden class gets invoked to solve a problem that they encounter. We get to watch how a moment of classroom science instruction focused on models and designs or food chemistry or something else travels home and gets kind of built into argument interactions with siblings and parents around the dinner table, for example. So we get to see these kind of pathways. The work is taking place in a neighborhood that we refer to as Granite Hills. It's an urban multicultural neighborhood near an industrial section of town. The city's generally wealthy, although 1 in 5 residents was not born in the U.S. And the city trends towards kind of having north-south segregation by ethnicity and class, and this work is taking place in the poorer part of the city with kind of a largely kind of Asian set of families, and you'll see in a moment. And we have this partnership in place with the elementary school in that part of town. So to give you a quick sense of the community, it's a very multilingual community. It's diverse in many dimensions, and there are kind of all sorts of stories to tell about how they manage this heterogeneity within the community, both in school but also in the community. But this particular sketch comes from the school and actually pretty dramatically underrepresents the diversity in the sense that these are kind of language affiliations for the most part for the students, when most families are actually multi-ethnic and multilinguistic. Okay, I'm going to tell 2 stories now that come out of this data corpus that both kind of intersect with kind of learning across formal and informal spaces. The first has to do with Sam and kind of how focused interest and expertise serves as this really strong influence on the learning pathway that he pieces together. He was a 4th grader when we started, the only son of a couple. The mother immigrated to the U.S. when she was younger. Mother works at a financial plan, and the father repairs computers. And so as an only child, he engages in a lot of home activity by himself and constitutes that by himself or with his mother. And you kind of get a sense of his areas of expertise there at the bottom that he's developing. So now I'm going to take you to a moment of Sam in the Pacific Science Center at what's referred to as the gravity wall. And we were there for just over kind of a 3-hour visit relatively early on in the study. And he spent over 30 minutes with one exhibit, really being the only person interacting with the exhibit to develop it. It's a relatively straightforward thing where you have kind of a pinball kind of thing going on, where you have kind of balls running down these slanted planes that you piece together by kind of sticking the boards into the slots that are present. And so he goes through a very complex set of activities over 30 minutes of kind of piecing together what he's doing on this space. The mother is opposite him, about 4 feet away, interacting with him every so often, but not directing activity. He's really engaged in this himself, and that if you describe, in terms of describing it, there's very consistent self-directed problem-solving sorts of behaviors throughout the 30 minutes, and there's an iterative testing of these design modifications that he's working on in his work. So there's this increasingly, again, another layer of complex self-posed challenges that he's working towards, and those evolve over the 30 minutes, and they get harder and easier kind of in different directions at different moments, where he's trying to go minimal and use the fewest number of slots, or he's actually trying to build traps to capture balls in different parts when they fall in certain paths. So if we then pop out and look at this 30 minutes and try to understand, so how do we understand how that 30 minutes fits into the broader life of Sam and his expertise as he kind of orients to it and is trying to make strategic, directions towards. You get this image that I'll now be pulling from the ethnographic data. So Sam's leading definition for what counts as science, when you ask him that question, he'll say, well, it's building technology. Like for him, our children have very kind of a broad set of ideas about what counts as science, from, because science is a conjury of all sorts of different subfields. But for him, building and design of technology in particular is the leading definition. Sam, in kind of these elective moments of his life, is just a consummate designer and builder in multiple categories, and you can just see him do this all the time in home life, whether it's bionicles or construction kits. or robot kits. And he has deep facility with doing this work and expertise in terms of managing kind of the details of that physically, and also understanding kind of the mechanical engineering aspects of these things that he's piecing together. So when we kind of pop out and think about this, then we get a frame that for Sam, this notion of thinking about structures becomes an important thing. So Sam has this long-held interest and now a fully developed and developing expertise related to physical structures and systems, and that this ends up being a very strong filter on what he does as he navigates across settings. It shapes his learning choices both on the museum floor and in school and in moments of home life. And his parents, play into that in very instrumental ways to support this developing expertise. Sam, in the classroom setting, is very often not engaged in classroom instruction. When you actually ask him about school and how it could be changed to connect to him more deeply, he describes how he feels like he's kind of in his own island in the back of the room thinking about structures all day. And there are particular moments of the school curriculum that will be related to thinking about structures, particular kind of engineering-focused science kits, for example, where he can bring his deep expertise and interest and map it squarely in. But otherwise, he's kind of seen as being off-task and resistant to the goals of classroom activity. So in this sense, Sam's quite staunch commitment to his expertise development complicates his public kind of academic identity in the school. And it sets up very palpable tensions between kind of the formal structures of school and his developing expertise. That's the first case. Second case, Brenda, and this is a story about a disconnect in science learning across formal and informal settings. She's also a fourth grader, different classroom. Brenda she's the only daughter of a single mother, Stella, and was adopted from Haiti when she was 10 months old. The mother immigrated from Haiti when she was a teenager. The mother works as a manager within a large health provider. You get a sense there at the bottom in terms of what kinds of activities Brenda engages in across her life. Gives you a quick sense, and I'm going to take you into some of that quickly. So we go into a moment of fourth grade instruction where they're using an off-the-shelf commercial kit called Food Chemistry from the STC company. The field notes kind of systematically are documenting how the children in the study are kind of engaged in activity in that setting, and across moments of that kit where it calls for doing what's called systematic mixing to test for fats and different things. She's not engaging in that practice. She's kind of opting out of that activity. And if this was a single site ethnography of this child, that might be the only image that you have of her engaging in this practice. Because we're across setting, and I apologize for the big white block across her face, she actually routinely engages in that practice at home. Over the 6 months of the study where we were able to spend time with her, every Saturday there was a chunk of her day that was set aside to perfuming. And she would do it in ways that was incredibly striking from the point of view of a science educator. So it's instrumentally tied up with this box, which has very scary imagery on it, and I apologize. And there's a little bit of a story about this box, because it turns out that a teacher ed colleague of mine, her son developed the box, or helped develop the box. So it has kind of an educational history that's relevant. But it brings people into kind of a scaffolded mixing experience that actually has quite a bit of fidelity to kind of formal science education and science inquiry. If you step back and look at kind of this practice that happens in the home, it's jointly, accomplished by Brenda and Stella together, sitting side by side at the table, as they always are. They're kind of like this dyadic pair as they do home life together, very different than Sam and his parents. And perfuming has a very instrumental use for them. They give it as gifts. They mist it throughout the house. It has a very functional, it ties into how they think about health and how to be healthy. And from a science ed point of view, they're controlling for contamination. They're measuring, systematically. They're actually tracking and labeling samples. They're journaling results. They're experimenting, developing their own nomenclature to talk about different characteristics in the things they build. And so it has all these features that you would love to see in the classroom. When we tried to develop kind of a longer developmental story of where this came into place, turns out the mother tells the story of Brenda starting to do mixing when she was 3 years old, when she would hang out on weekends with her cousin, and they would be doing this at the grandmother's house. Within Haitian communities, the activity system of cooking often uses mortar and pestles instrumentally. Like the grandmother has 5 different mortars and pestles, and almost all of them are in use on the weekends, right? And so the children would come in and grab one and run off to the bathroom, and they'd be mixing up their own things. And so it's the kind of taking the cultural artifact that's within the home and running off and embedding it into play activity and kind of coming to see your interest mapped into that. This is that kind of story. It's a very kind of anthropological story. And so then you have the mother seeing this kit one day at the store and understanding that, you know, it ties directly into how Brenda thinks of science, which for her isn't about building technology. For her, it's doing chemistry. That's her leading definition. And that's how she construes her scientific interest. And then it's also very likely there's a pedagogical influence coming from Stella. The grandmother is a classroom teacher. And so you have kind of the mother of Brenda getting oriented to professional teaching and learning sorts of strategies through that particular pathway. So to pop up a level, everyday chemistry is a fixture of the Joseph home, but Brenda does not bring that established practice to school. School science underrepresents her expertise if you only look at her in that setting. And I think for a lot of formal educators, this violates a commonly held assumption that the children are most scientific when they're in formal instruction and the supports that come with that. When in fact, for several of our children, they're most scientific in disciplinary terms when they're at home and they're engaged in other sorts of activities. So Brenda's not recognized in school as being interested in science or any part of the school day, actually. And so in this sense, you know, it's a real disconnect that's dangerous in the sense that she wants to be a chemist or a paleontologist or an archaeologist. Those are her 3 leading categories. And so in some ways, that disconnect between how she's viewed in school and how she views herself is troubling. So I want to bring us back and kind of move towards closure. So we have these accounts of learning pathways across settings that we're piecing together and trying to reconstruct across the lives of 13 children and the ones they interact with. And to pop up a level, Ray McDermott, he's an educational anthropologist, and he says, after 100 years of anthropology, we know 2 things, and then Fred Erickson layers on a third. Ray says, the first thing we know is that everyone is busy all the time. Even the kids in the back of the room when they're checked out and they look like they're off task, they're busy, actually. And his second point, everyone is making sense all the time. Like, we are all in the mode of making sense of what we're experiencing, whether or not it aligns with the expectation of the particular context we're in or not. We're all in an active mode. Fred Erickson layers in and says, well, meaning is always local. Like, the particular things you steer towards are those that come from your perception of what to be driving towards, which is why kind of the real EMIC, or trying to understand the members' meanings, the participants from their perspective, is an important part of why ethnographic work speaks to these complexities. So to pop up, learning happens across places and pursuits in complex ways that need to be better understood, especially in matters that are personally consequential and meaningful. In Washington State, the science standards were kind of by design, and the state tests were designed not to include personally consequential science knowledge, and that sets up all sorts of driving forces on the particulars of science that get taught and learned. The second point that Bronwyn also brought into focus earlier, learning is broader than schooling. It's also broader than informal education. We need to work to better understand and align the intentional structures and activities of education with the everyday interests of learners and the diverse textures of places and pursuits that are bound up in the lives of those that we're caring about. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bronwyn to hear about CILS research.
Thank you. And I'm about to switch gears so dramatically that I just want to try and segue somehow. But to say that I hope that, I mean, I find that really fascinating. And I think it really makes the case for the emergent nature of learning. And if we think about learning as emerging over time and place, I think it can really radically change the way we think that we, working in museums, contribute to emergent identity as somebody who's interested in, who knows something, who participates in, who can contribute to going forward. So that's a whole other discussion, and maybe we can have it in a little bit, but I think it's really critical for the museum field to start to think about learning in that way. complete change of topic. What I was going to do is share a study with you that gives some evidence for the importance also of thinking about working with schools. So this is quite different. And to pull back a little bit to think about just how we work together within the educational landscape and array of opportunities. CILS, under the leadership of Doreen Finkelstein, did what we called a landscape study a couple of years ago. Some of you may have received our surveys. We surveyed a couple thousand informal science institutions. So again, as I said before, nature centers, zoos, aquaria, science museums, a whole range. And they were very extensive surveys that were asking about the nature of work that the museums were doing with schools. So we just wanted to kind of get a marker in time to understand what was going on. And so here I'm just going to share some of the results of this. Is the first phase of the study that we did. Actually, we found, this is from a presentation I did for Science Centers, we found about, broadly speaking, about 75% of the responding institutions said that they reported partnerships with schools that are more than we do field trips. So these programs range from teacher professional development to classes to curriculum kits, et cetera. And some of the programs, Science Centers and zoos, were not more than 90% likely to report such sort of sustained relationships. In fact, more than 50% of the institutions offer teacher professional development workshops and programs, again, beyond just an orienting workshop to the institution. The analysis revealed that what that meant was that the informal science institutions were reaching about 62% of American schools. 2 million teachers were participating in programs, roughly 36 million kids. And actually, 44%, so almost half of the schools that people were reporting partnerships with came from communities that were high poverty communities. So disproportionately then, disproportionately the audiences from schools were from high poverty communities. And I think this is a really important point to make, and I actually meant to make it to begin with, that as we know, our audiences tend to be educated, middle class, upper middle class, usually white people who come to our museums. And it's, museums have a long history maybe of having audiences that are not necessarily representative of our communities writ large. Working with schools is one potential way to actually work with and reach out and engage with a much more representative and sort of democratic institution and representative population. So we are interested in the work that museums can do with schools from that perspective of access and equity. Finally, just a sideline that most of the programs, 72%, said that they targeted elementary schools. So we got these results, and it looked like, wow, there's a huge amount of work going on that informal science institutions are doing with schools. Everything is great. But we kind of know from our own work and from our work with colleagues around the country that, in fact, the relationship with schools is not as robust as maybe these numbers revealed. So we wanted to look a little bit deeper. And when we did that, we found that, in fact, even though all these programs were being offered, more than half of them said that they could take in more people. So they weren't filled to capacity. And moreover, and I don't have the percentage here, but to a very significant degree, schools were not actually paying for the programs. They were either offered for free, or the museums were getting grants to provide them. And finally, they were very often not assessed for any kind of impact that they would have in the school context. So sometimes satisfaction surveys were handed out to teachers in teacher development workshops, or people who use curriculum, what have you. But in terms of why somebody from a school setting would come to an informal setting to develop their practices or enrich their curriculum or whatever it was, there was no looking at, in fact, were practices enriched? Did the curriculum change or expand as a result? So that sort of matched more what we were thinking was happening. But then we did another analysis, and Jason Ravitch did this analysis with Doreen. We found that when the informal science institutions reported that they had co-designed their programs with colleagues from the schools, or they were assessing effects within the school context. So as I said before as examples, they were looking for, whether or not teachers changed their practices, let's say. We found that it correlated strongly with institutional growth. So, and that meant both, budget was increasing and staff was growing. So we saw this relationship, just to repeat, between strong, healthy institutional growth and paying attention to the needs of schools and providing programs to them. So that was interesting to us. That was sort of the first phase. And then we thought, okay, so we know this is sort of on the surface. What's actually going on? So we did, in phase 2, a follow-up with 3 different programs, and we had an outside researcher who was looking at the Exploratorium and also the Natural History Museum in New York and the St. Louis Science Center. And basically, quickly, the methods were to observe, to interview, to review the literature, and to look at program documentation. So the things that we found in some were that sort of the features of these partnerships. I actually didn't say this. We chose partnerships that were the programs that were sort of highly regarded, that were correlated with institutional growth and staff and budget, and that had evidence for outcomes. So these were the features that we found in those partnerships that sort of matched the profile that we found in the first phase. That there were shared long-term goals, and the goals really were not, it's very important that they were long-term in relationship to what do we want, in this case, science education to be in our community. So museums and schools coming together around a vision. They also used research-based approaches, meaning they used either teaching strategies or curriculum that was based on research and sort of evidence of effectiveness in various ways. But importantly, it wasn't like taking school curriculum and doing it in a museum setting or other way around. It was really attuned to the local setting and the affordances of the setting. Also, and you all may know this, and just it's true generally in life maybe, that the leadership part was absolutely key. So there were these sort of personal levels of commitment, history among leaders and people in the school, in the museum, that were working together, and a lot of time and effort went into cultivating those. Which is interesting. It raises a question of, well, then how to create structures that can survive the transitions that happen in leadership. It was also important that each of the partners was really clear on the benefits to them of the partnership, so that they weren't just doing it because they had to or because they were supposed to or because the other person wanted it, but there were clear two-way benefits, and that there was assessment that was actually geared toward that, collecting data and keeping it on the table related to the purpose and the impact and the institutional benefits. So those were kind of the findings around the effective partnerships, and what we're going to do in the next phase is to apply these findings back to the sort of larger set of data that we have from phase 1 and do an analysis of whether those hold true or not. That's one study. Some of the implications of this are, as I said earlier, that the successful partnerships translate to institutional health for museums. They correlate, I should say. That they have shared, articulated, and assessed long-term visions that extend beyond the museum. Again, it's thinking about the broader landscape. And that they build on the institutional strengths, and not trying to become something that one isn't. I really, actually, we're about out of time because we want to save time to talk back and forth. But there are 2 other studies. I just have 2 slides. I will just even look at them just to say that this graphic that I showed earlier, we're actually applying it in the study of the National Science Foundation Academies for Young Scientists project, where we're looking at 16 different out-of-school time programs. We're working to develop a sort of a logic model with each of the programs to understand how they are situated within their particular local context. So if you look at the pie plate again, how the after-school program in most cases, the one at the top, how it's maybe contributing to the development of certain capacities that kids, let's say, are or are not, so sometimes reinforcing, sometimes expanding or challenging capacities that they're developing in other settings. And then also to look at it, again, bringing in these theories of cultural historical activity theory and neo-institutionalism and our definitions of interest, to look at how the programs are designed, the affordances of the programs to build these capacities. And ultimately, and this is sort of a phase that we want to do, to look at how the development of these capacities in these other settings start to play out in school settings. And then this is finally, we're also doing a study, we're just about to start in May, working with 24 educational leaders from different museums to, let me just get all this out on the table. We're going to work together to look at the nature of really effective inquiry-based interactive science education in out-of-school settings, and we're going to be meeting multiple times over the course of a year and a half to refine our thinking and to tweak the different programs that are already happening at these 10 or 12 different museums, and then actually to collect data on site to look at the ways that the programs build kids' capacities and how those capacities play out in other settings, and from that, in that process, to generate a set of standards with a small s, design principles and standards for what science in out-of-school, inquiry-based interactive science in out-of-school can look like, and have some evidence behind it to connect the experience with the programmatic features. So those are just 2 studies, and I think we want to thank you for your time, and here's our contact information. And we're open to questions and comments. Thanks. Does anybody have anything you'd like to share?
Well, so, the true confession response is to say, well, the focus of my work is at kind of at the intersection of learning and science, right? So I actually can't speak to the details of that. Although I'm sure that I suspect the room probably could, in terms of how people are seeing kind of the particular issues that are kind of raised here around science as a particular set of disciplinary ways of knowing and thinking and interacting, and how that would carry over into kind of other kind of disciplinary realms. So at some level, I'm kind of bouncing it back to the room. But I would say that we have had productive projects that span kind of multiple disciplines, science and history, for example, trying to coordinate programs across the two, both, for example, leverage kind of working with evidence and construction of arguments and competing interpretations and learning that kind of gets laminated on top of that kind of frame in parallel ways that we then can differentiate kind of across those 2 endeavors, to not take on everything but those 2, kind of what's parallel between those 2 disciplinary perspectives and what's actually quite unique, and actually, at least for the purposes of education, need to be differentiated so that not all ways of knowing collapse into one mishmash of different perspectives. So that's my initial reaction. I don't know if you have other perspectives.
The only thing I would say is that, like, if you look at this graph, which it's just one idea, but it's specifically not science specific. It's really about capacities that pertain to any kind of domain, and so the only reason I throw it up there is I think the idea of the various capacities that are involved in historical understanding, understanding in art, understanding in literacy, and I shouldn't say understanding because that's too narrow of a word, but sort of English language literacies, historical literacies, whatever they are, you can think about how museum programs build different features of and capacities that lead to emergent learning, the emergence of learning and sort of commitment. So it may be around ways of knowing. It may be around ideas in question and wonder. It may be around cultural, the practices and actual use of tools. So I don't know if that's of any help, but I don't think, even though our studies are specific to science, I don't think the general idea of how can museums design programs in their different disciplinary domains that engage and lead toward the emergence of learning is impossible. If that was a good ending. Is that?
Okay, I guess it's on the wheel. About the expert. Everything's pointing toward the expert. What's pointing away from the expert?
What's
pointing away from the expert? I mean, when you become an expert, isn't that your responsibility to become a mentor then? I think that's really important because I work in the Natural History Museum as a docent, and I have had contact with a great deal of the wonderful scientists that work there. And there is somehow, it's the dialogue between the general public and the scientists is sort of not there because they don't have a way to do that. Mentoring, I think, needs to be part of this whole scheme of becoming an expert. I've raised 5 children. I've got 2 grandchildren now, and I am in the belief that it's not about going to one point, it's becoming something and moving out away from that. So
yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think the idea is that to move from novice to expert, and really it's just using a construct that was developed by Levin Wenger in their book Situated Learning, but it's related to Vygotskian perspectives on learning. It requires the active participation, co-participation of more expert others, and not necessarily people who are expert, but people who know a little bit more, who can bring people along and sort of develop their practices. I mean, that's one piece of what you said that I think is very true. So this is more about expertise rather than a person who's an expert. But the other thing I think you're raising, was that experts themselves need support in how to help people come along, and I think that's very true. I mean, we see that a lot in the sciences. So it's a whole other sort of thing that actually museums can be wonderful sites for helping people who have a lot of expert knowledge learn about learners and the process of dialogue and what teaching and learning is all about. But it doesn't happen automatically at all. I mean, there are programs, and it takes time, and you need to really attend to that. Otherwise, you have people who are talking at, not with.
Please.
Hi, my name is Diana Njai. I'm at the Center for Folk Life and Cultural Heritage. And actually, there are 2 things that I wanted to mention. First, I thought actually 3 things. I thought that the presentation that you made had so many great applications, and both within science and outside. And I guess my first comment had to do with the young lady who asked about applications outside of the field of science. And I'm going to go real personal here. I'm an anthropologist. I'm also a visual artist. And my daughter's a visual artist right now, and she learned almost everything she knew about visual art inside of museum settings through informal family visits, and through the kinds of experiences that were available both within museums in terms of observation and so on, and also participation in a home setting, but outside a formal setting. And I can see direct application within the arts and within communities in terms of learning this. As a folklorist, anthropologist, if you look at how people learn about, to become artists in a traditional cultural setting, they're also doing that mix of imitation and observation which is very close, which is sort of can be applied to a museum setting as well. Now, the second thing is, what was interesting to me is when you were talking about how you were working with families who are museum-practiced families. And I thought that that was really significant in that perhaps we need to look at training families who are not museum-practiced families to become museum-practiced families outside the learning, the settings, because I think that a lot of times when there are families who go to museums and they interact in different ways, and to me what was most exciting about what you said was, you know, how do families take that learning into different settings? So I don't know, those are the two things I got out of it. Thank you.
That's very helpful. And the image that you kind of brought into focus through your first set of comments is deeply resonant with kind of a social image of learning between a group of people that are all kind of becoming disciplined in whatever way in terms of how they see the world and how they interact with it and how they participate in communities. And that kind of can travel across different kinds of communities, whether it's focused on kind of arts or visual literacies or science. So that's a very productive frame. I think Bronwyn's comments before also fit into that same zone. The second part of your question about the non-practiced families or the kind of otherly oriented families, and we do have kind of a follow-on phase of families that we are recruiting who are kind of very active users of community-based programs but don't go to science centers for kind of a range of reasons. And so these are, you know, families who are quite instrumental in their framing of how they go out into the community to kind of bring educational experiences into play for their children, but for whatever reason just haven't gone to the science center yet. And so we're kind of doing studies with them to try to understand kind of the differences between these two, because there are very strategic, specific uses of the science center that the practice families employ and how they make sense of what they do. One thing that I'll say, though, that kind of complicates that frame is that one of our families, 11 of the 13 families immigrated to their first-generation immigrant families. And so one of the families came 3 years ago from a refugee camp in Kenya, and what was interesting when we went to the science center with them for the first time, the 3 children, it was a use of the museum that was stunning in a very unique way, in the sense it was the first time ever in that kind of environment ever in their lives. And they were using it very instrumentally to try to understand possible futures that were in the sciences that were related to their interests but they knew nothing about. And there's this one corner that's still just vividly etched in my mind of this young 5th grader who he's a very accomplished soccer player. He's very academically focused, and yet he wants to be a scientist. He just doesn't know what that path looks like, right? And he comes across a kiosk exhibit, a set of 6 videos of scientists in biotech talking about their life histories becoming biotech scientists, and he just devours that set of videos. He sits there for a half hour just soaking it up. And you can imagine that kind of use of it from a non-practice, quote-unquote, user is very powerful and amazing in and of itself. So I worry about the frame of practice leading to some monolithic image of this is what families should do, and so we should steer them all towards one thing, because there might be a variety of different kinds of instrumental uses that are actually a better frame on how to think about it. Question over here on the aisle.
Well, it sounds to me like the students are being directed towards those interactive kiosks, and I'm curious to know, are the parents more involved than just sitting on the bench kind of offering feedback?
So there's a slide that I didn't get to in the interest of time, and it has to do with the instrumental role of parents in architecting these learning pathways. And so support shows up in many forms. And so to some degree, the parent sitting on the bench and letting Sam have his time with the gravity wall can be seen as a choice by the parent, an active choice to let Sam do his self-directed kind of inquiry with that wall. right? So I wouldn't want to, ascribe that, just because there wasn't like active co-participation all the time in all activities, that the parents were somehow not supporting learning. Because in some ways we were just at a conference where, thinking about parents not helping with homework can also be viewed in some ways as them trying to cultivate kind of a self-independence in their child, right? So the null action of a parent could be kind of for a learning purpose. I think on the other part of the slide, and I don't know if you have parent-related things to chime in, like there's just a vast variety of things. So you have families who are too poor to go to the Science Center, who end up going to the state fisheries because it's free and it's open on Saturdays, and they use that as the informal institution to allow the child to gain access to animals. And so you have that kind of situation take place. You have within the Filipino network, within community, within Seattle, having multiple sets of godparents is very normal. And so for another child, she has 5 sets of godparents, and each one kind of has a domain of expertise that they're in charge of in terms of cultivating in the child. And one's kind of like the math godparent, and one's the technology godparent. And so that's just a very amazing kind of practice to set up how to arrange the network of people in the community to help cultivate a child in ways that are seen to be valued. And so I think there are a lot of detailed ways that parents are very actively involved, from moment to moment to interaction, all the way up to kind of trying to bracket time and space for their development of expertise and identity. Please. Yeah.
I would also like to call attention to that example you gave about Brenda, who really identifies with using science outside of the home, or in the home but not in the classroom, and really is not identified as a science-oriented student in the classroom, and how in those non-traditional areas she is probably more easily engaged by that process. I can remember as a youth, I would love, all of my friends and I would love to go to the Science Center, and we loved playing at the Science Center, learning about all that stuff, but we were never actually associated as science students. I know when we had to we went to the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh, they have the art and natural history and history museums, and they also have the Science Center. We were always so excited to go to the Science Center, but for some reason, like in Brenda's case, that never actually translated into the classroom. So, now I'm a historian and not a scientist, and yet, you have the dual experience. So I was wondering if that experience that you had with studying Brenda's case, if you were really working in some area that would help to highlight the differences between being engaged by the sciences versus engaged within the school curriculum.
So in that particular effort, I quickly described the 7-week curriculum project where we were trying to take into account children's everyday expertise in their formal instruction. And in that project, what we tried to do was to provide viable classroom techniques that allowed the expertise of children and the interests of children to be made visible of their own volition in ways that then could be connected to instruction within that unit. And we were, I think, first iteration, we were working with an existing curriculum. We made some progress in that direction, handing cameras to children across the classrooms to have them bring aspects of home life in was a very concrete way that they could bring aspects of who they want to be or who they're thinking about being or what they like to do that relates to what they think the unit is about into the classroom to reshape. The other place where it happened more deeply, I think, is at the tail end of the project where they're learning about microbes and microparticles and health and and nutrition, and then they end with a research project, and it's a very open, self-directed research project where students get to map their interests more directly. And so Brenda did a very kind of science-related research project around, it turns out to be around sewage treatment facilities and kind of how they do their chemical activity. So towards the end of 5th grade, she started to be perceived as having interest in science, and in part it was because of trying to architect these spaces as part of the school day that allowed that interest to be surfaced. Although there's still a lot more work to be done in that direction. I don't want to claim that we've got it figured out, because it was complicated, because the kids didn't expect that their out-of-school lives were relevant to the learning of science in the classroom. And so their first impulse is not to bring it. because they've been kind of taught by that point that everyday life isn't actually relevant to the teaching and learning of science as it's typically constructed in their experience. Okay. Thank you.
On behalf of the Smithsonian, I'd just like to thank Phillip and Bronwyn for the presentation today. And because there was so much information here and many references to research, you might want to watch the museumstudies.si.edu website, because it will be posted up there if you want to go back and check some of that or follow up on any of the information that's up here. One last reminder, and for people who are more in the history museums, the presentation on May 6th on the role of museums in formal education, again looking at the relationship of the two, will have an emphasis on the research that's been done recently around how museums have impacted the learning of history in schools. So I think we'll probably have lessons that can carry over at that time, but it'll be more of a focus on history. Heather? Yes, as part of the presentation. Okay. Thanks, Heather. And